Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And we're always happy to welcome Archer Mayer back, albeit virtually, for another event. And for those of you watching, I'll be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Archer, go ahead and put them in. And we will be getting a bunch of signed copies of his brand new book, Marked Man, which Barbara is holding up the advanced copy of. So I'll put a link in the comments field too, should you like to purchase one. I think that my spiel has been concluded. I'm going to hand it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It depends on whether Archer is able to best UPS, which is not cooperating in this. I have to tell you all that are watching these that the shipping systems everywhere are really overstretched, and things that used to happen quickly and certainly just aren't happening anymore. So it requires patience. In fact, the publication date for this book got moved back, but Archer's actually in possession of our books. We just have to get them from Vermont to Scottsdale. Thank you, UPS. So there's always something. We've been together for decades now. This is Archer's 32nd book. I personally collect them. I fell in love with his very first book, and I think Open Season, Archer, you might have had to end up giving me a copy because I couldn't find one anywhere. Is that right? I know you gave me a book. Was it Open Season?
Oh, I could easily believe that, Barbara. Open Season was such a rare hen's tooth. I think it went through 3 editions to come up grand total to a fraction of what a regular printing is now of a Joe Gunther book. I mean, I don't remember the specific numbers anymore, but each edition would be a few thousand copies, which basically hardly gets out the door. So I wouldn't be at all surprised. Damn near hand carried it to you.
Well, it might have. I probably whined. You might have been. I remember ordering it from a bookshop back in your area. Archer is the Vermont guy here, and I was outraged when they told me later they just couldn't find it and couldn't send it to me. Subsequently, I've developed more empathy for those booksellers because it happens to us. But at the time, I thought, gee, they run a really terrible operation. So anyway, I always learn new things about Archer when we talk. And one thing I did not know, looking at his bio, I had no idea you were half Argentinian.
Oh,
how
yes.
did I not know that all these years?
I haven't the slightest idea. I'm not shy about bragging about my mother's provenance, but yes, she was born and bred in Buenos Aires, which we refer to as BA. And she was, surprise, surprise, a precocious and wild child, which obviously I didn't inherit one bit of that, but she left Argentina in World War II and came up to New York working for Time Incorporated. And that, actually, it was amusing. My father was the head of Time Life International at the beginning of the war, and he went on a tour of the world and got off of his DC-3. And as he's climbing down the stairs, everyone in VA was taking photographs of this guy because Time Incorporated, Harry Luce, I mean, that was the big cheese. And so this was a kind of celebrity, not that my father ever marched that line. Anyhow, he came down, he was photographed, and it appeared in the newspaper. And my mom's mother said, "Look at that man. He's the man you're going to marry," which was very amusing because my mom did indeed work for the same office. She was the sort of the bureau chief running the not business chief, but the clerical chief. She ran the typing pool and all the people in the office of Time Life in BA. But and this guy was supposed to be her temporary sort of passing through boss. Didn't turn out very well because he crossed the threshold and she's looking at him a little warily. And sure enough, the first thing he did was fire her boss, whom they all adored. But they adored him for all the wrong reasons because he was a womanizing boozer. And my father went, nah, that's not very efficient. So he went out on his tail. So shall we say things started on a poor note, but I'm the evidence that things seem to have worked out.
Well, and that sort of explains part of your early career because you have a background as an editor, researcher for Time Life books, a photographer, and a journalist before you took up. And I know I visited you in Vermont, in Brattleboro, although you live near Brattleboro, not actually in Brattleboro. So, as I remember, you have been a detective, an EMT, a firefighter, a ski patroller. You work for the medical examiners. Actually, you're a death investigator for the Vermont office of the chief medical examiner. Have I missed anything?
No, that's actually what I'm doing right at the moment. In fact, I'm on call right now, but I'll try not to be rude if my clientele leaves me alone for the next hour.
Oh, that's really scary. He could be called out to an actual crime scene, leaving me here
It's
talking
with
to
me,
myself.
you
I love it. So, as I mentioned, Markman is the 32nd in the Joe Gunther series. And I love it because not only does it keep us in Vermont, but it actually takes us to another state, Rhode Island. And in a few of the books, Joe has ventured out of Vermont. We've been to New York, I can't remember all. But I think to talk about Markman, we need to go back and talk about Tagman for a minute, Archer, because it's really hard to understand Sally if we don't do that. But first, since this is your first event, I'm raising a glass and a toast to you and Joe.
Well, thank you very much. I wish I could reciprocate, but I'm stuck in this computer and reaching for something might cause a catastrophe. So,
Well, it's my fault. I should have reminded you that BYOB is all of our events, but it's 8 o'clock at your time, so it's not cocktail hour, but here in Arizona where it's 5 o'clock, it's definitely time for wine.
many thanks. And may I add that the longevity and perseverance of Joe is largely thanks to you and your ilk, but you in particular, because as you pointed out, we go way back, and without your support, it would have been a lonely road. Certainly.
Well, I do admit that I had to kick your ass once or twice when you were thinking about giving it up. But what I didn't know then, and what you didn't know then, is that Marco was going to come into your life and take over for me on the spot. So well done.
Yeah, no, it's all worked out pretty well. This is really a habit I can't seem to break, and nor do I wish to. Yeah, it's astonishing to think that I just finished number 33. In fact, 2 days ago. I'm editing it now, and as usual, page by page, realizing what a terrible writer I can be at times. But at least I was trained as an editor, so in one of my 400 earlier jobs, and so I'm utterly ruthless with my own writing. I tear it to shreds. Not once, but up to 15 times per manuscript. So I just go over
Wow.
and over. Oh yeah, no, it's very heavy lifting. And the reason being is that I want to translate the rough material of a told story, I hope well told, into what I aspire to be sort of a musical assemblage of words that take over the reader's brain. So when you read my books, I hope a movie turns on in your head and you take over, you're in control, and I disappear, because that's, to me, the job of a good writer is to vanish and to yield the storytelling forum to the reader. Because as a reader, where I like to go is into my own space, where all these voices are alive in my head and all the descriptions have 3 dimensions. I can smell the odors described. I can see the colors described. And I don't want the author to screw up or otherwise, display his or her presence. So.
Well, you do it very well, and you do it with multiple characters too. And it's wonderful when you read them that Willie or Sally or Joe and various of the team all have their own voices. And you've also evolved some of the characters. I mean, Joe's current personal life was not one we could anticipate some books back. But anyway, let's talk about Tagman and Sally, because that, I think, for some reason, which you could explain to us, you are still so in love with the concept that you introduced in Tagman. There's something about that character and his, I don't want to call it profession, what would I say, avocation, that just continues to intrigue you.
Yeah, he's driven. It's a psychological need on his behalf. Part of his DNA has been given over to essentially snooping on other people. He's not a thief, although in a way he is, and he's not a trespasser, although he most obviously is, uh, and on down the line. But what he's a watcher, and he may be one of these guys that John le Carre so loved, who just wanders around behind people and follows them wherever they go and observes whatever they do and knows everything they do. And such is the way of Dan Kravitz, who he's the guy that when you go to the gas station, he's way in the back doing something with a broom. You can sort of see vaguely his outline, but you don't actually see him because he's an invisible human being. But when he goes home at night, he sits in his office and he is surrounded by computers. So those computers are locked into all the phones, all the computers, and every other electronic device that he has tapped into and put a worm in as he broke into high-end houses. The only thing he ever stole whenever he enters these places is he eats something out of the refrigerator and leaves the evidence behind. In addition, in the bad old days, before he decided to become a little more discreet, he left one of those little yellow Post-it notes right next to the people who were sleeping in the house at the time. This is crucial to him. They've got to be there. He will not enter an empty house. And that message will be, "You're it." And thus he was labeled the Tagman because of that. I guess I invented this guy and I remain enamored of him because it's just so creepy. At some point in our lives, all our lives, men, women, children, adults, whatever it is, you have that feeling you're fast asleep, you open your eyes and you think to yourself, is somebody in the room? And Dan Kravitz would say, yep.
Sort of like Harriet the Spy, but a grown-up guy. Actually, the morality of it is pretty slippery, and you get away with it because he doesn't actually steal anything concrete. There's not money involved, but there's no question that he invades people's privacy, and he's a hacker in a way. I just love the hack into what's it called, the right-wing hosting site, Epic or whatever it is. And I couldn't help but think about Dan, when I read about that how these guys, the Proud Boys and all the rest of it, thought that their stuff was all perfectly safe and didn't recognize that their host was not particularly good on security. But I love the fact that it's outed all of them. And, Dan could actually do that if he ran across, nefarious stuff. So in a way, he's kind of a shadowy agent of order if it were really required. But
Yes.
but the reason I wanted to talk about him in relation to Markman is he's trained his only child to do the same thing.
He did train her, but he also trained her to be an independent thinker, and he honed and polished her own inner sense of integrity. And thus, when she became of age and he, having trained her, said, okay, you want in on the family business? He was not only understanding, but empathetic when she said, you know what, I don't.
Yeah.
It just not the right thing to do. And of course, there's the divider between, as I pointed out, a man who is driven psychologically to do that. Well, that comes from inner forces. Well, his child is not driven by the same thing. She's a different human being. And so she found it intriguing and interesting. I mean, what kid wouldn't find it fun to break and enter into places and poke around on other people's personal stuff? How much fun was that? But she also grew her own ethical sense of right and wrong. And thus she said, you know what, I'll take your skills that you provided. And I'm obviously not divorced from you. I'm your flesh and blood. I'm your daughter. and I will apply them in the terms, the strictures, if you will, of being a private investigator. And private investigators, at least in the state of Vermont, are far more regulated than cops are. They have many more controls over them and prohibitions stopping them from doing things that cops will do, in a breeze. So she likes the structure. She obeys the law. She never does what her father does, but she will use him because, talk about the most magnificent deep throat. This guy is connected to everybody in town because he sits in these computers, as I mentioned, and he's eavesdropping. Every keystroke comes onto his computers because anybody who sends an email to anybody else, that worm captures them and sends them to him. So he only has to do a few break and enters and taps into a few devices. Those exponentially get duplicated out there, because if you had been broken in by him and you sent me an email, now my email is in his computer, so he can capture what I'm saying as well and what I'm doing. So in a way, he's got this terrible air traffic control problem, which I don't bore the readers with, but he's got to sort of marginalize all this data so that it's relevant to Brattleboro, Vermont, and stuff like that. So obviously, when Sally, as a private investigator, needs to get some information that does not compromise the integrity of her legal case, she can go to her father and say, what can you tell me about this guy or that guy? Or should I watch out? Is there a danger here? Or what do I need to watch out for? And dad will deliver, always being respectful of her parameters and her strict limits that she puts on him. So it's a wonderful relationship. And he always makes her cocoa every time she visits.
Well, it's a wonderful relationship for you because it lets you do a lot of stuff that would be kind of hard to do otherwise. That's very interesting about private eyes being more regulated than cops, because generally it's the other way around. And cops find private eyes to be useful because they have fewer constraints, whereas the cops have to hew the line if they, if they're ever going to take something to trial, they can't afford to mess it up. So that's fascinating. Is that unique to Vermont?
No, I think it's generally true. And of course, you put your finger on it. For example, the subject of curtilage, which is essentially trespassing. Cops have to observe that. You can't trespass. You can't go through someone's garbage in Vermont, not until it's hit the landfill, which means you have to follow that garbage until it gets into an open space where anyone could gain access to it. Private eye can do whatever she wants. You're not supposed to trespass. You're not supposed to take photographs through windows, at least with a telephoto. You can use a normal lens, but not a telephoto, because that gives you a mechanical advantage. Really, it boils down to what a normal human being can do and see. A private eye can do and see. But the same token, she can knock on a door and walk in, or do whatever she wants to do without a warrant necessarily.
Right.
Cops have to have warrants. They have to have a judge sign off on a good many of their actions. So it depends on who's doing what as to who has the advantage, the police or the private eyes. There aren't many private eyes in Vermont, and most of them are going to probably operate out of Burlington, which is the most populous city in the state. And also, of course, they do stuff that's not the least bit fun. Real private eyes, they're doing the case of the guy with the neck collar because he's trying to collect on some insurance fraud, and they take photographs of the guy without his collar on, or they're doing the sneaking Tom stuff in a divorce case, which is completely that their private eyes will do all sorts of things that are frankly illegal, but it's not a legal case, so nobody cares. One client hires them to find out if so-and-so is cheating on them. It's all behind closed doors. It's a private transaction. And so is it legal? No, it's not legal, but it's not a legal case. And as you correctly point out, for a cop, it's always a legal case. They don't recreationally go around and do that.
No, and they don't want to lose in court because of some technical, kerfluffle that they made. You know, look back at Kinsey Milhone. I mean, Kinsey, a lot of her work in Sue Grafton's wonderful series came from insurance companies. The
Yep.
same is true with V.I. Warshawski in Chicago. Is that VI, I think if I remember right, for a lot of the books was on retainer, you know, from an insurance company looking at fraud and other kinds of things, industrial espionage, you know, family drama, all kinds of things that cops can't get involved in, which, you know, doesn't really matter whether Vermont is small. Now, Rhode Island has a reputation for lots of criminality. So if you're going to go to Rhode Island, I can see how this is all going to work. But let's go back and talk about, what is his name? Nathan Lyon. And to do that, you know, I remember visiting you and looking in Brattleboro, and in fact, it's true in other parts of Vermont that you've written about, that there are often, because the industrial age has come and gone, so to speak, in New England, there are often fairly large buildings that are just vacant and need to be repurposed, or end up being kind of flop houses. Or, do you know, Archer, we saw the most amazing one. I thought of you when we were traveling in Romania, and we took a side trip before our Danube River trip up to Transylvania. And there are some beautiful valleys in those mountains if you leave Bucharest and drive up towards what is supposed to be Dracula's castle, but of course really isn't. And the communist regime there under Ceausescu built some just ridiculous, enormous valley-filling facilities that actually never had a useful industrial purpose, but they're so big and they're crumbling away, but tearing them down will be so expensive and polluting and so forth, that they just kind of sit there, these ruined hulks, you know, like some dinosaur that, you know, stretched up the valley. And I don't think Vermont's that bad, but nevertheless, you take advantage of something like that in setting up Nathan and his family. So tell us about it.
Well, it was a fascination on my part. You drive by, as you point out, and they're wonderful looking. They're red brick buildings with huge windows on many of them. There's this sort of industrial majesty to these buildings. They're just terrific. There's such an eyeful. And because of the lack of electrical lighting, they are covered with windows. And really, when you wander through them, you can see why the birds are flying around indoors, because it's just terrific, and you don't get rained on, at least not much, except for when the roof leaks.
Right.
So it occurred to me, all right, so you get these, and as you point out, some of these are being repurposed rather successfully. There are several in Brattleboro that are now incubators, and they have multiple businesses and gyms and God knows what.
Well, and let me intervene and say that the internet age has allowed a place for those. But I mean, a lot of them were built along rivers for the water power and all the rest of it to power the mills and so forth. But in an age of computers and all, these buildings actually have some legitimate claim, you know, to being useful again.
If they have access to that, those electronics, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is a tough thing in Vermont, because location in Brattleboro, which is the 7th largest city in the state, I can show you place after place after place where your cell phone is as useful as a brick.
Yeah, well, but you can build more cell towers. I mean, you know, it isn't, you know, the two problems confronting us, in fact, in this electronic age is a constant flow, reliable flow of electricity, which, as we've seen in California and other places, is not to be taken for granted, and access to cell signals. But the good news is that cell towers can in fact be built, although, you know, a lot of them are, I mean, aren't most cell towers privately funded? Aren't they corporate? Or I mean, I don't think they're not a government kind of a facility, are they?
Not in Vermont, they aren't. No,
I don't think they are anywhere.
There's a big push in Vermont to spread the wealth border to border. But that's all done in cooperation with companies. You're quite right. AT&T is, for example, in my village of Newfane, Vermont, AT&T is the tower owner. And they lease and sublease and what, you know, so other people can take advantage of that same structure. But you know how it goes. So you're quite right. The government stays out of it except to grease the wheels and try to make things attractive and open up permits and blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, long story short, I decided that wouldn't it be fun if you took one of these monstrous buildings and instead of doing an incubator, you made a single family dwelling out of one. You know, this is 150,000 square feet because it's 5, 6 floors tall. I mean, this is the biggest goddamn building you could set your eyes on. It's just ginormous, as my daughter is fond of saying. And one owner. Well, he has a family, and the family, of course, they want to play at being entrepreneurs. So one of them may be a potter, and the other one may do this, and the other do that. So he has a couple of these or a few of these outlets on the first floor, but all the rest of it is just they're sort of like homes within a home. And one guy describes it as a village under one roof, filled with rather cranky people, because typical of a complicated family run by an almost Rasputin-like father figure, who, by the way, is dead at the beginning of the book. All these forces are chewing on each other rather unattractively by and large, and since they're murder mysteries, even lethally, but they're all under one roof. And so I sort of thought this would be the first time I've ever done this. Usually I use a town or a village or the whole state, or where, as you point out, you know, but this tickled my fancy. So I went with it. Now, the guy who begins the story dead came from Rhode Island. So it did allow me to wander away and go down to, as you correctly point out, was in its heyday, no longer, the crookedest state in New England. Between the Catholic Church and the mafia, not much was run straight up and narrow.
Very, very true. Actually, in a way, you've done a sort of an Agatha Christie country house murder thing, you know, because if you take one of these giant, you know, English castle, manor house, you know, estate, whatever it is, and you put in, you know, the family patriarch who has control of the money, and, you know, the cousins. What was that movie that, you know, was made not too long ago with Daniel Craig and everybody?
Knives Out.
Thank you. Knives Out. I mean, you know, it's not that big, but the, you know, that kind of idea of, you know, a containing single structure, and, you know, somebody running it with lots of dissent, but the guy running it has all the money and the rest of them haven't figured out how to break away, or they're just massively resentful. And then there's usually one person who is either a favorite or is functioning better than everybody else, and on and on. I mean, it's a really classic, you know, design for a crime novel, but I thought you gave it a fascinating spin, and I could kind of see the building.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted. And it was also my pleasure to, in a way, almost have 4 books in one, because I have a somewhat complicated mind, and I didn't want to just leave it at the, at the Agatha Christie lookalike. So I started with that, absolutely, or Knives Out, or however, whatever, you know, predecessor is there. And then I just went boom and had great fun with that.
Well, you did. You know, and the great thing is you can populate all the other people in this contained space with motives. It was, you know, true of Christie. I mean, basically everybody there, you know, has some kind of a motive, some kind of secret or hidden agenda or resentment or, you know, whatever it is. And because there's a surplus of motives, you know, it's the reader gets to watch it kind of all unfold and try to guess which motive is more compelling than any other motive. And it can also be really difficult in an environment like that to establish any kind of alibi or location, you know. You can't. It's not like you can take CCTV and track them down to the pub and say, no, at the time of the murder, you know, the guy was on his 3rd pint down there at the Pig and Whistle. You know, in fact, British crime novels, Archer, you know, have become so dependent on CCTV, you know, and cell phone location and all the rest of it. It's harder and harder for any individual to conceal his location or send any messages unless he's smart enough to have a burner phone. I mean, they can read everything that you've texted, or if they can't listen to your calls, they can at least see all the numbers that you call.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a real challenge to the author of, of a mystery, of crime fiction, to try to figure out how to get around all of these devices.
A lot of this is helped for we Americans because we don't have as much
No, we don't.
circuit TV. That's the Brits have it all over us. And time again, I remember I worked for a police chief once who tried to rig all of downtown with cameras. And he got the grant and he ordered the cameras and all the rest of it. And he was about to put them in. And he sort of said, oh, by the way, to the town council, I'm going to be having guys on ladders. They're going to be putting in the cameras. And typical of American democracy, of course, only then did they go, you're going to do what? And of course,
Yeah.
he's telling them this for 12 months. And they wouldn't let him do it. He had to give.
Oh, I believe that. We had, cameras on our interstates here. And there was such an outcry from the citizens who thought, better to have one person ripping around at 130 miles an hour, individual. We are not a country where individual liberty is so over, well, individual liberty doesn't accord as well as it once did, I think, with, dense society and, the kind of web of living that you almost have to create in order to live together successfully. I mean, we're seeing it fraying all around us over, what are we doing about masks? What are we doing about vaccines? What are we doing about this and that? And, it's a terrible collision of what people, and people misconstrue the Constitution constantly. They're constantly saying, oh, it's my constitutional right. Well, it isn't.
No.
It really isn't, but it's just what they're basically saying is I am free to do anything I want, regardless of the common weal. The whole concept of a common weal is gone.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely correct. Absolutely true. Yeah. And it's an interesting time for me to write within these times along my lines, which is law enforcement. Because I don't play with the rules. I mean, I'm an ex-cop, so by God, I follow the rules, and I have police officers proofread my manuscripts before I send them in. So I've got to follow the straight and narrow because I don't want readers to come back to me and say, well, you can't do that. This is just make believe. And, and it's funny, I had an interaction. This is a little bit off the subject, but I had an interaction yesterday with a reader who sent in an email and said, poor Willie Kunkel. Willie Kunkel is one of my characters and he has a bad arm, but he's allowed to function as a cop because he's in a special unit. And so he sort of bypasses a lot of the physical norms of regular law enforcement. And of course, his mentor is Joe Gunther, and Joe Gunther gets to special privileges. So Willie Kunkel has this bad arm, and I refer to it every book because it's a reality. And this woman said, God, can't you give him a bionic arm? I'm sick of, I feel badly for him. I love the books. But I feel so badly for Willie, and I want you to put him into a robotic arm so that he's whole and complete and entire once again. And I wrote back and I said, in effect, lady, you're missing the whole point on two levels. One is that the bum arm is obviously metaphorical on one side, but it's also what Willie needs. It's a reminder of the bad decisions he's made, of the corruption that he's overcome within his own soul. It's a metaphor for a lot more than just, oh, he's a half-built man. But more to the point of our conversation was that no cop in Vermont is going to have a robotic arm. I'm sorry, it ain't going to happen. He doesn't get paid that much. The state doesn't support you that much. There's not a mechanism around that I can conveniently conjure up to turn him into Lee Majors of the $6 million man, who would now, of course, now be a $1 billion man. But I want to deal with the reality around me, and that's the Vermont I write about, is the Vermont I travel around nonstop, and or Rhode Island in
Yeah.
this case, and I absorb all that and I try to give it back to people so that they can look out the window while they're reading and go, oh, hey, he's describing my world and my
Well,
people.
it's certainly true that the cost of something like that, the government pays for veterans and so forth, or there's a lot of help for veterans, but he wouldn't qualify. Talk to us about the medical examiner and her daughter, because that double relationship has become much more important as the books have moved on.
Yes, the medical examiner has been existent from book one. Her name is Beverly Hillstrom, and she's actually based on a real human being who has since died, who was chief medical examiner of the state of Vermont and a very dear friend of mine and a big fan of the books. But where Beverly Hillstrom in the books is tall and lean and athletic and blonde and all this stuff,
And ageless, apparently.
and ageless. So yeah, look at the writer. Uh, the real one, Eleanor McQuillan was her name. Eleanor McQuillan was about that tall. She had to do her autopsies on a stool, standing on a stool, because she couldn't reach the table otherwise. This was a midget. I shouldn't say that. This was a woman of short stature, pardon me. But she had a brain like a bear trap and put up with no nonsense from anybody. And when she did go out on the occasional field call, which chiefs are not supposed to do, but she would, she'd pop open the trunk and put on her muckluck boots and push people around. And
Yeah.
no one crossed Eleanor McQuillan. So that was the beginning of Beverly Hillstrom. And I autographed my very first book to her when I handed it over for reading, and I said, "From one tall, leggy blonde to another," and she loved that. That totally suited her. Well, Beverly Hillstrom is all of those things, but she's also compassionate, thoughtful, a really hard worker, and a perfect soul mate, if you will, to Joe Gunther. But we didn't know that for something like 25 books because they were co-professionals. They trusted each other. They relied on each other. They depended on each other. They counted on each other. But they were always involved in some other person. She was married or he had a girlfriend or whatever it was. And as we journeyed through or continued to journey through these now 30 plus books, it seemed a natural conclusion that these two people who had spent, funnily enough, more time together than they ever had with their inamorata should finally commingle. And to me, it's the best of friendships. It's a lovely, respectful, caring, and trust-laden interaction that they've given birth to based on case after case after case. And my hope was that when I brought them together, uh, that the readers would almost sigh with relief and go, oh, at last, these two are finally where they need to be. Well, she had two daughters as a result of her previous marriage. And one of those daughters, Rachel, Rachel Reiling, is a budding journalist. And she comes to us. At first, she was a student at the University of Vermont in Burlington. And we watched her sort of grow a little. As usual in my series of books, you don't grow nice, sweet, and innocent. So she had her rough patches and had her fair share of witnessing homicides and whatnot. I mean, how many of your roommates were murdered in their beds? But, such is the life of Rachel and anybody else who inhabits my books. So she proved to herself worthy of her mother's DNA, shall I say.
Yeah.
And she moved down to Brattleboro, and she has become best pals with Sally Kravitz, who is the marked man's daughter and the private eye that we were referring to. So now you have this interesting dynamic. You have Joe Gunther and Beverly Hillstrom representing the hand of the law, if you will, through their various offices. Then you get the private eye, who of course represents something different, as we touched upon. And last but not least, we have Rachel Riley, who represents the press. Now, Rachel and Sally just connected, and they are, in the classic old novelistic phrase, bosom buddies. Nothing sensual, nothing sexual. These are best pals. My daughter has several of these, one particular one when she lives in Philly, and she helped me see this through her example, that you don't need to necessarily overlay every relationship with a sensual aspect. Sometimes you can just be the best of friends, and you just can't, better being together with one another, sharing a spoon over ice cream. And that's it. So these two unlikely people with curiously contrasting but occasionally complementary jobs, with the mothership hanging over the head, interact in a wonderfully complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes antagonistic way. And that's a dynamic that never runs out of gas, because from situation to situation, they're going to move as to
Oh,
how.
that's right. I mean, you've got Rachel chasing a story. You've got Sally, who's got a skill set that few have. You've got, Beverly as the medical examiner, Joe and his team as the cops, so you can really get into some complicated stories. And most of your stories really are complicated. I mean, they're never simple. And they do take us, they've taken us around Vermont. They've taken us up to Canada. Now we're in Rhode Island. We've been to New York. Where else have we been?
Oh, Chicago, Montreal, Quebec.
Right. Well, the Canada part's really natural, because until the border closed during COVID, I mean, Vermont is a border state.
Yes.
I mean, it's the border state thing, so often people think about it, it's just, applies to the Southwest. But in point of fact, we have an enormous border with Canada. So, if I'm talking to Michael Creed about Maine, or I'm talking to you about Vermont, or Kent Kruger about Minnesota, or, somebody writing in Montana, even Washington, they're all border states.
Much longer border up here than it is down south, funnily enough.
Well, in Detroit, I was thinking about Stephen Graham Jones, who writes about Detroit, and he pointed out that there are actually more illegals that come into Detroit, across the water, which they can't really defend, than come in through Texas and Arizona. But the focus, the political focus, so much of it is on the Southwest and the southern border. I think it's remarkable that we've had such a great history with Canada for so long. And I hope we can go back to it, but I was somewhat dismayed the last time. I think I was at the Vancouver BoucherCon, and we elected to take a rental car and drive down through Washington and drive down to Seattle. And the border crossing was a nightmare. I mean, it wasn't that, it was like Hitler, running. It was like the Nazis, or it just took forever. It was incredibly slow. And it used to be that you would just drive across and wave, or hold up your driver's license. It doesn't work that way anymore.
No. It's become a demarcation of great severity. There's a building in northern Vermont where there's a painted line down the middle of the dance hall, and
Really?
the dance hall is in Canada, and the other half is in Vermont. And it used to be of the old days that every Friday night people would dance in and out of both countries, just playfully, and it was all understood. And indeed, that line was not metaphorical; it was the border painted on the floor. And that building is now closed, and you can't do any of that. And there are fences and all sorts of. Yeah, it's all that's gone.
I took a train from New York. I decided that it was easier, pleasanter, less expensive, but that wasn't really my motivation, to take a train from Penn Station to Toronto, where there was another mystery convention. And I was in a hotel across the street from the Toronto station, and I was staying in New York right down the way from Penn Station. And I didn't really think about how complicated it was going to be to cross the border. And, you know, you have electronic tickets. So I had my phone, my tickets on my phone. I couldn't actually get a printed ticket. And when we got to the border, they made everybody get off the train, take all of their baggage. You had to go through Canadian customs. The guy was really, I don't know what his problem was, but anyway, he was really rude to me because I couldn't quite specify whether I was there on business or pleasure. I mean, what was it for me to be attending a mystery convention? It was clearly both, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, to get back on the train, you had to show your ticket on. My phone died. So now I have absolutely, and I have no way to show, but
Yeah.
fortunately, because I'm still old school, I had printed out something to, you know, that I had with me, and I was able to show it to the guy and say, you know, so they eventually let me back on the train. And I thought, seriously, I'm going to be kept, you know, and we're in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
you know, in upstate New York. I'm going to be spending the night here in upstate New York because my phone died, you know, which, and I thought, okay, you know, you look at those 1930s movies like Alfred Hitchcock, you know, whatever, to Strangers on a Train, and you think, okay, the whole deal was you had to have fake documentation, you know, in order to, and, you know, the Nazis were making life terrible for people, and there was all this forgery. And I thought, all right, today your phone dies and you're kind of in the same position
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
if you were in a Hitchcock movie. You know, I can't get on the train, help. And I thought, where did all that come from?
Yeah. No, it's, I don't know. It's become a really baffling world. I won't deny that I'm happy to be living in Vermont. And I say that with a certain amount of concern because we are in Vermont living in a bubble. We don't, this is far from reality. We have a basically one party state. Our radical concession is we have a moderate Republican governor who might as well be a Democrat. He's a lovely guy, and I vote for him every time. But my fear is, in fact, that the entire state 100% would go Democratic because then we'd have no balances whatsoever. It's funny living in Vermont, and it's not always as comforting as people might think it to be. But its reality and its weirdness certainly is not the national reality or weirdness. So it's,
How would you like to live in Arizona with this insane audit going on? I mean, yeah, it's been so unbelievably embarrassing and an incredible waste of money for absolutely no purpose except to cater, you know, to, well, I won't even go into it. But in any case, I think, you know, everywhere in the US is either a bubble or,
yeah,
you know, some kind of weird reality. I mean, you know, I just, you know, California's become like a third world country while we've been turning our back, you know, all of a sudden their entire infrastructure is, you know, completely fallen apart. And, you know, they're having brownouts and fires and everything because nobody invested in maintaining the electrical grid. And,
right.
you know, and everywhere you look, you have to just scratch your head and think, what on earth is going on?
My cherished son, with whom I agree on all things, lives in Texas.
Oh, okay. Well,
There's a man
yes.
under siege.
Imagine. Well, anyway, here we are, and you're right. Scottsdale is sort of a bubble too, or at least the part of Scottsdale that I live in. So, this is a lot of this is merely intellectual rather than actually life-changing. But we can't say a lot more about the Mark Man other than we've talked about the setup. The old rich guy is dead.
Yep.
The family inhabits this building, and you know, what are their relationships and who has the most powerful motive, who has no motive, what don't we know, how are we going to find it out? We have all these people. We have Sally, we have Rachel, we have Joe, the team. Beverly's the only person who has a pretty straightforward role. You know,
Yep,
she's
exactly
the
right.
medical examiner. So
Straight up and narrow, exactly right.
however, you know, even the medical examiner sometimes turns up things that are an enormous surprise to everybody.
Well, this was one of my favorite devices. Thankfully, it was at the very beginning of the novel. So the idea being, now my family is built of a nature that we give our bodies to science when we die. The flip side of that is that my entire family refuses to die, so we're all amazingly old when this happens. But regularly in our late 90s. But nevertheless, that's where you go. So I thought, well, okay, this would be fun. Let's do this to a character in the book. And at the very beginning of the book of this fellow, he's given himself to science, and you know, I've been there before because of my I once worked as a medical illustrator, and my first autopsies go back to the late 60s. So I've been in this turf for quite a long time, and my, you know, some of my best friends are dead, let's say, or at least in the dead business. So it was fun for me to confabulate this scene whereby a medical student, and my boss, the chief medical examiner, advised me on all this. And of course, you got to go to cadaver school. That's part of what you do. You know, anatomy 101. Every medical student has to go to it. So you go to this big cold room, and then you get this dead body, in this case, donated bodies. And it's such a popular thing to do nowadays that all these institutions have waiting lists. And so my guy, you know, Mr. Lyons, shows up, and so you're chopping away, and what does his death certificate say? His death certificate says what I fill out all the time: arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. You know, no big whoop, you just died of living. And you smoked and you drank and you were too fat or whatever it was, and it all caught up to you, and that's the end. And here's your death certificate, and that's the end of the story. So now you're on the slab, and this medical student is poking around, and little by little, when you take a body apart, it's a magnificent thing to do. I highly recommend it to everybody. But it goes on for miles. I mean, a human body is just a monument of intricacy. It's just, the bowel goes on for like yards and yards and yards. The capillary system could span the world, and on and on. So he's trying to identify each one of these things. He's got an atlas, as they call it, you know, showing how the shin bone connects the knee bone and all down the line. And he's slowly working his way up the neck, because the entire rest of the body has been opened up and displayed and laid out. You can see I had some serious fun writing this scene. And the last to go, because it's a separate class, in fact, is the brain. So you leave the head to last. And so he's working his way up the neck, and he discovers the dreaded hyoid bone. Well, the hyoid bone, of course, we know that from one novel after another novel after another.
Yeah.
I don't mind the occasional trope. I think that's great fun. So I threw that in because it allowed me, for the first time, all this viewing of TV that we do, we hear about, oh, there's the hyoid bone broken. Well, that means he was strangled. Well, that's no such thing. It doesn't mean he was strangled, but sometimes it does fracture when you get strangled. But what is it? So I tell you what it is, and I describe it for you in detail. And sure enough, I find a broken one. But more importantly, you know, the physician in charge goes over the shoulder of the medical student and says, you know, a lot of people have broken hyoid bones, you know, the big whoop. So I love throwing that in because it destroys the convention. But what do you find under the hyoid bone? Oh, a hemorrhaged soft tissue, bleeding musculature. Well, I'm sorry, but you can't have one without, you know, if you have one with the other, then that means force has been applied. And that's not a good thing. So all of a sudden, you know, the student turns to the supervisor physician and says, well, you know, what is it? And she smiles and says, it's a homicide.
I love it. And on that note, let's call Patrick up and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Excellent.
I think you've stunned them. They're all enjoying it, but I keep asking for questions. I don't see anything specific. Let's see. No, there's not a specific question. Someone's saying how creepy the Tagman is.
It really is.
Oh, you have no idea. I used to do a thing when Tagman comes out, just like when they all come out, and especially in those days, I used to go out to bookstores, and so people would say, well, Tagman, how did you come up with the idea of Tagman? I mean, that's sort of a creepy idea. And so I would always take some sort of slightly elderly person in the front row, because I'm very hands-on when it comes to these what I call author imitations. And so I'm doing my spiel, and I don't read from the book. I interact immediately, and I entertain questions, and I go back and forth, and I try to make them laugh and entertain them. And so when that question inevitably came up during the release of that book, I would walk up, just as I'm doing with my hand, and I'd get closer and closer and closer to this poor, usually little old lady in the front row, and I would stand that close to her, and she would get really uncomfortable. And I'd say, now pretend you're fast asleep in your bed. And every
You
time
had Post-it notes in your
someone
hand.
in the room would go, "Ew," and I went, wow, that's where I got the idea for the Tagman.
He is creepy. I don't think there's any question about it, but incredibly useful. I honestly thought that he was going to be a one-book wonder, but as I said, Archer clearly has found him to be too fascinating to abandon. It's been 10 books.
Yeah. Now, the design is always like with Willie Kunkel. The design is always bring them on and don't hold them to any expectations. Bring them on and just let them do what they want to do. And Dan Kravitz, like Willie Kunkel, simply never went away.
Right. Life of his own. Indeed. Well, Patrick, if there's no more questions, I'm going to say it's been a wonderful hour as always, Archer, to spend time with you. If you're a fan of Julia Spencer Fleming and you listened to a conversation we had not long ago, Julia credits Archer with a lot of help and inspiration for her series set in Maine. I think if you're a fan of C.J. Box or Michael McGarity, where CJ's Joe Pickett's remit is Wyoming and Michael's remit is New Mexico, and there are other examples, Robert Parker Spencer in Boston. It's fun to Margaret Maron's wonderful series, The Bootlegger's Daughter, and all those, North Carolina.
Paul Dworon.
It's Sorry, honey?
Paul Dworon.
Yep.
Yeah, in Maine, Paul Doiron in Maine. It's wonderful to be able to have, well, Tony Hillerman is an obvious case too, the Navajo Reservation, Tony and Ann. And Margaret Cole, when she wrote about the Wind River Reservation for the Arapaho. And James Doss, remember James? He wrote about the Utes in Utah and Colorado. It's wonderful when the landscape, the culture of the territory becomes a main character in the books. And it's certainly true in the Vermont mysteries that Archer writes. So there, every once in a while, it's fun to go to, say, like corrupt Rhode Island and spend a little time. In fact, Don Winslow's new trilogy that has been postponed to April, but it's about Rhode Island, Archer.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so we'll get to, there's been very little set, hasn't there, Patrick? Very little set in Rhode Island. Bruce, what was his name?
De Silva.
Yeah, thank you. Bruce De Silva wrote some very good books set in Rhode Island, but it's not been a heavy venue, let's say. For
you don't want to tick off anybody in Rhode Island and it might rub you out.
There you are. Right. Anyway, Archer, thank you. Give Margot our best. And I hope that you will eventually prevail over UPS, and our autographed copies of Marked Man will eventually get to Arizona. So please be patient, everybody. We're sorry about the delays. So wishing you a great evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Bye.